I'm thrilled to be joined for the hour by Tom Friedman. I know we have a lot of people here who have differing perspectives. Some will disagree with Tom, some will not. I just want to emphasize the importance of people being kind of respectful. You can put comments and questions in the chat, and I'll convey some of the ones that I think are best. But I want you, and the questions can be challenging and probing, but I really want to make sure that people are respectful in their responses. And I also want to say something about Tom that some of you may not, who only know him as a public figure, may not be aware of, because I've had the chance, even though he and I have not interacted that much recently. Earlier in my journalistic career, when I was in Washington, I had the chance to spend some time with him. And I think one of the things that people may not appreciate about him, perhaps just if they know him as a public figure, is actually what a remarkably kind of generous and decent, kind person he is, one-on-one. I mean, I was not, he was already Tom Friedman by the time I hung out with him. And I was a journalist in my 20s. And one of the things that really struck me was just the humility and kindness and wisdom that he showed me in our conversations. And so anyway, I've always been really grateful for that. And it's kind of been a model for me as I've gotten older about the way I try to interact with younger people. So Tom, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Peter.
I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the kind of arc of your life as it interacts with Israel-Palestine. Because I think perhaps one of the reasons, you've been influential for many reasons, but I think one of the reasons that American Jews have identified with you so much is that the arc of your life has in many ways, I think, been kind of a stand-in for the kind of life experiences of a lot of American Jews, particularly of your generation. And I know that I think your first really important experiences with Israel came when you were in high school, just after the 1967 war. And so I'd love you to just talk about what that was like for you, just still as a young person, and what Israel and Zionism came to mean for you at that early part of your life.
Sure. Well, told a lot of this in Beirut to Jerusalem, but just to review, so I was born in Minneapolis. I was born in North Minneapolis, about 3 miles from where George Floyd was killed, because I was born in 1953. And Minneapolis at the time was in the 30s and 40s, I should say, was the capital of anti-Semitism in America. Had a deeply anti-Semitic government city government until Hubert Humphrey took over. Hubert Humphrey was a real hero in my family's, in our household for my parents. And so basically the Jews and blacks in Minneapolis lived together in a ghetto on the north side. And after the war, the Jews were able to escape. The blacks weren't. There was still lots of redlining for Jews, by the way. And basically in a period of about 3 years, the entire Jewish community, virtually the entire Jewish community of North Minneapolis, moved to one suburb called St. Louis Park. And overnight, a suburb that had been 80% Protestant Catholic, Scandinavian, some German, became 80% Scandinavian Catholic, German, and 20% Jewish. I mean, literally overnight. My aunt and uncle moved one door down this way. Another aunt and uncle moved one door down this way. If Israel and Sweden had a baby, it would have been St. Louis Park. And that's where I grew up. And my first real encounter with both anti-Semitism and pluralism was in this remarkable community. I saw pluralism work. We built an amazing community. And as I told in my last book, thank you for being late. So I went to Hebrew school or Sunday school or regular school with Michael Sandel, the Harvard political theorist, Al Franken, Norm Ornstein, the Coen brothers. Their movie, A Serious Man, was about our suburb. Peggy Ornstein, excuse me, Sharon Isbin, the guitarist. It was a remarkable place. And we're that first generation of American Jews post-war who kind of shot out of a cannon and really able to have these opportunities. So I wanted to be a professional golfer until I was 15. And then two things happened when I was 15. My parents took me to Israel to visit my sister, who was on her junior abroad at Tel Aviv University. And I had a great high school journalism teacher, Hattie Steinberg, who changed my life. And I had that teacher, who changes your life. And her journalism course is still the only course I've ever taken. Not because I was that good, but because she was that good. Anyways, my parents took me to Israel over Christmas vacation. I'd never been out of Minnesota except a few forays into Wisconsin, and I'd never been on an airplane. And maybe it was a shock of the new. Maybe if they'd taken me to Shanghai, I'd be a sinologist today, or to Athens, I'd be a Greek specialist. But that was sort of this huge encounter, with the Middle East. And I became fascinated. I went back. I lived on a kibbutz all 3 summers of high school. And during that period, I got as interested in the Arabs as the Jews. And I started taking Arabic as a freshman at the University of Minnesota. I spent my summer between my freshman and junior and sophomore year at Portland State University on an NDFL grant studying intensive Arabic. Did my sophomore year at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Did my junior year semester at the American University in Cairo. And so I always had this interest in both communities. I got a Marshall Scholarship. Eventually went to Brandeis, got a Marshall Scholarship to go to Oxford. Actually spent a year in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies, studying with PJ Vatikiotis, a great Middle East scholar at the time. Eventually went up to Oxford and got a master's degree in Arabic and Middle East Studies from St. Anthony's College, Oxford, which is the sort of classic British Arabist, education. And it was a great experience because when I was there, the Lebanese Civil War had started, and St. Anthony's is the international relations school. And it was very small, only had 120 students at the time. So we all ate together. And I really got a huge introduction into the inter-Arab dynamics because the Lebanese Civil War was going on at that time. I got my start in journalism. I'll end this in a second because in 1975, I was walking down a street in London with my then girlfriend, now wife, Anne, and I noticed a blaring headline on the Evening Standard that day. The Evening Standard always has those blaring headline, Carter, and this one said, "Carter to Jews, : if elected, I promise to fire Dr. K." And I stopped my then girlfriend, now wife, and pointed out that Jimmy Carter was running against Gerald Ford for president and was promising to fire the first ever Jewish Secretary of State in order to win Jewish votes. And I thought, isn't that odd? And I have no idea what possessed me, Peter, but I went back to my dorm room and I wrote a column about it. And my then girlfriend, now wife, happened to be next door neighbor of Gilbert Cranberg, who is the editorial page editor of the Des Moines Register. And she took my column home on vacation with her, walked it over to his house. He liked it. They printed on a half page of the Des Moines Register with an Outh cartoon, and they paid me $50. And I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. I was walking down the street, I had an opinion, and someone paid me $50. And that's how I got started. And so during my time at Oxford, I wrote for the Des Moines Register and the Minneapolis Star and Tribune op-ed pieces about the Middle East. And that was my clip file that I applied to UPI in London with. And I got hired in London on Fleet Street in 1978, and they sent me to Beirut in 1979, and I'll just end here. And the first 2 stories I covered were the Iranian Revolution and the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Little did I know those 2 stories would shape the rest of my career.
So I guess just to go back to those early encounters with Israel, you wrote this, I think, column recently that a lot of people were talking about called "The Israel We Knew Is Gone." And it made me wonder what the Israel was that previously existed for you when you first started going there as a kid, as a high schooler, and fell and became so engaged. I mean, obviously you connected to the entire Middle East, but obviously 3 years on a kibbutz, something about Israel, particularly it seems like really spoke to you. What was that?
Well, I identified with the opportunity and right of the Jewish people to build a state in their historic homeland. I did then and I did now. But I equally felt from almost the moment I discovered Israel that enterprise could only be successful if the right of Palestinians to a state in their historic homeland were paired with it. And, I've actually never believed anything else since. And what I think is so alarming about this moment, that column obviously could have been written at different times and different moments. maybe other people would, but it seemed to me that there's a whole set of equilibria that we're keeping the two-state solution on life support, if nothing else, and not just the two-state solution, a democratic Israel, an Israel where separation of powers between the political and the legal system, where there was a balance between Jewish and secular, where there was just a whole set of equilibria that have enabled us to manage the conflict enough to at least entertain the illusion, and it may only be that there is still a two-state solution. And it seemed to me this government that was elected seriously imperils that. And that's why I wrote that headline. I could have written I wrote that headline, by the way. We write our own headline, so I can't say that someone else, and don't want to say it, someone else wrote it. But it was to sound an alarm bell. That's really what I was intending to do, without any particular certain logic underneath that. It seemed to me that we're on the edge of something that would irreparably and irreversibly change some things that would both change the character of Israel in ways that were really dangerous and eliminate any possibility of a two-state solution. So that's where it came from.
So as you know, there are people kind of up to your left, and certainly a lot of Palestinians who would say, listen, is the idea of Jewish democracy was always a contradiction. There was not a liberal Israel. It was a state that was built on the mass expulsion of Palestinians. It held Palestinians under military law from 48 to 66. Then it conquered the West Bank and Gaza, and for most of its history has held millions of people who lack basic rights. Even the Palestinian citizens, they can't ever really be full equal citizens. So there's a fundamental contradiction in this principle, and that as believers in liberal democracy, people would argue, and again, you've heard this argument probably more times than you can count, that fundamentally this is a moral contradiction. How do you respond to that?
It probably is, but first of all, there's a lot of moral contradictions in the world that we have to deal with all the time. The world's full of them. Perfect, in my view, is never on the menu, particularly in the Middle East. And for me, I'm always looking for least bad. And the least bad way to resolve this, to me, is a two-state solution. And that's what I've always worked for. That's what I'm trying to keep alive. That's why I conceived of and promoted what became the Arab Peace Initiative. I'm not out for perfect. I don't think perfect's on the menu. I'm out for the least bad for the most people.
Why do you think that it's not possible that a single equal binational state, although not perfect, could be better, in the sense that it could be at least premised on these principles of equality under the law, that obviously we want in the United States? Why do you think that would be worse rather than potentially better, although obviously not perfect?
If we could go back in a time machine and start all over from the very beginning, and there was no hostility between these two communities, maybe that's possible. But Peter, I lived in the Middle East and covered a Middle East where Sunnis and Shiite Muslims couldn't live together. I can't think of a single experiment in the Middle East that in any way fits with that vision that makes it even remotely possible. I do believe that if people first live apart securely, they may be able to confederate in something close to what you're talking about. But I think people have to be secure in their own space as we sit here now. They have to be secure in their own space before Israelis can say to Palestinians, now what was it you were trying to tell me about the Nakba? Or Palestinians can say to Israelis, now what was it you were trying to tell me about the Holocaust? When people are living in fear all the time and not secure in their own space, that's never going to happen. And I don't think you can just leap from where we are now, as idealistic as that might be, to that kind of solution.
And so if you're confronted with a Palestinian refugee or their child or grandchild that says, listen, Tom, people like you and Beinart, you haven't lived in this part of the world for 1,000 years, and you can go back to the places that you were from, but we can't go back. Your response to them would be, yes, you are right in principle, morally, but I just don't think it's practical. Is that a good practice?
And there has been an unbroken settlement of the Jewish people in parts of Palestine, for millennia. If we want to get into that debate,
No, no, I agree. I totally agree with you about that.
That's my whole philosophy is and it's reflected in my column is, do you want to make a point or do you want to make a difference? There's so many points I can make on both sides. We can go here for the rest of our conversation. I've always been focused on how do I make a difference to make this work better for more people on both sides on more days in more ways. That's all I can contribute right now at this point, and that's what I'm focused on.
So if one assumes that let's assume that the two-state solution is the best answer, the best paradigm, there is still the question of whether it's possible, right? I mean, you itself, I think just a minute ago said, maybe it's an illusion. How do you measure that? What would it take for you to say, okay, it is an illusion. I think it was the best answer, but it's not on the table anymore. So now I'll look at what's behind door number 2.
Well, it's interesting. In one of the things I did on this last trip, I went to see one of my favorite people, Khalil Shikaki in Ramallah, the pollster. And Khalil's just done some very interesting polling. First, he found the latest polling, which he does it with a partnership with an Israeli polling team, that 43%, that if you ask Israelis and Palestinians, what is your preferred solution right now? A two-state solution is still the most preferred solution by both sides. 43% of Palestinians, 42% of Israelis. So I would start there. Second, when you start to drill down on the actual, what it would look like, it tends to lose support in both communities when they actually see some of the trade-offs. But as a principle, is that
because they mean different things by two-state solution.
Right, exactly. That's why when you drill down, it can lose support. But then they've started to do something really creative, and that is they ask paired questions. So they'll say to Palestinians, if Israeli Jews recognize the Nakba, the suffering of Palestinians, and even the injustice done to them, would you, in turn, say something about the Holocaust, or recognize the right of the Jewish people to a state in historic Palestine? And the increases in yeses go up 30 and 40% on both sides when you pair sort of really deep recognition of the other's fears, concerns, anxieties, and sources of anger. And I found that really interesting. And if you go to their website, you can see actually the pairs they put together, and you get increases of up to 40% of what people are ready to do. And so I would rather invest my time in thinking about those alternatives rather than leaping to something I don't think is realistic at all.
So if it sounds like you're saying that with the right kind of visionary leadership, with these series of kind of compromises and bargains, you could create more support for a two-state solution on both sides. And I guess that's what Khalil is arguing. That's what Khalil, right. So I guess in terms of what kind of US policy might make that more likely, you wrote in the recent column of the Israel We Knew Is Gone column, you said that the new government will send friends of Israel in Congress fleeing from any reporter asking if America should continue sending billions of dollars in aid to such a religious extremist inspired government. So I wondered if you weren't the reporter running after the member of Congress, but you had some reporter running after you, how would you, in light of what it would take to get to the solution you want, do you think that there should be some conditionality in aid? Do you think the aid in the form it exists now is justified? The way I would put it is that I've always been for, going back to the beginning of the peace process, but particularly the Baker years, which I covered closely, vigorous and energetic US diplomacy that puts down markers. And I don't want to just jump to, would you withdraw aid? Because that's going to, first of all, I'll say that, and 10 people will go out and tweet something right now. I take completely out of context what I say, which the whole ecosystem exists out there to do. Okay. And so on these issues, Peter, I'm going to be very specific with you. Whatever I think, I'll write it down. I'll think about it 10 different ways. I'll measure everything I say, and I'll say it then, but not to you on the fly, because I know how people will use this. Okay. So I'm keenly aware of that. And so
these are things that I've written about for a long time. I would want to think exactly where the boundaries are between diplomacy, withdrawing aid and whatnot, and I'll write it when I write it.
What are the things that you're suggesting in the answer is that you've become, you're in a situation where you have to think carefully about how you express yourself because of the dynamics that exist. So I'm wondering what how over time you've learned to deal with those pressures as being someone who has a kind of public persona, and therefore kind of has enemies, and to what degree you feel like that's a challenge in terms of just being someone who wants to be able to just kind of have opinions that you can express, and obviously not all of our opinions are always right.
Well, it goes back. There was this publication that when I was in Beirut in the summer of 1982, it's called The New Republic. I was one of its favorite whipping boys.
Yes, I remember.
So I actually had Twitter in my life before, and that was because I was being too kind and understanding of Palestinians in Beirut.
Right.
And so I've had a version of Twitter in my life long before there was Twitter.
Right.
And those days, I would come home and I was just a reporter then. I wasn't a columnist. And I'd say to my wife, like, I'm just trying to do the best I can. Why are these people, But I learned a long time ago, beginning back then with the New Republic, Peter, that in the Middle East, everyone wants to own you. And if they can't own you, they want to destroy you. No one puts their arm around you and says, Tom, I really appreciated that critical piece you wrote. That was really thoughtful. And so I've actually never looked at Twitter. I've never looked at Facebook, and I've never smoked a cigarette. And my plan is to die saying all three. I use Twitter as a broadcast platform. I'm told by my assistant who runs my account, something like 930,000 Twitter followers for my column. And if you, Peter, call me up and say, Tom, I've got a new book out. If I'm interested in it, I'll have my assistant tweet it out. I don't know how to do it myself. But I stay away from all social media. I do read the comments on my column, every one of them. So I have a very good proxy for kind of what's out there. But I have seen how these social networks are destroying journalism because everyone's walking around looking over their shoulder. I see this with reporters. They tell me, and they get eaten alive on one social network or another. And I think it can be a really distorting thing. So I'm very careful about where I appear, how I appear. As you know, I wasn't even wild about doing this, but I did it for you, so I think you're on the level. But I don't do this because what happens is people are just sitting out there. They're sitting out here right now on your website, I should say, I'm sure, some of them, and just waiting for me to say something that they can weaponize and then use against me. And so I'm going to be very, very careful what I say, because this, by the way, it happens in Israel, same thing. I go to Hebron on a reporting tour, and the Jewish settler guy, tweets out, we had Tom Friedman here, showed him around, didn't agree with him, but here's a picture. And that immediately becomes a cause celeb. I'm told, again, people start sending it to me. No one was there the next day or 2 days later when I was in Ramallah doing the exact same thing from the Palestinian side. So I just find the whole thing really, it's an energy suck, Peter. It drains your energy, and I don't want to drain energy. I'm very careful not to. I managed to write 7 books and do this column because I keep my eyes on the prize, and I'm not out there surfing around thinking about what people are writing about me, because I think it's just really corrosive and just energy sapping.
Do you think that the pressures, those dynamics exist on every issue, right? I mean, do you think they have a special or different character or greater intensity when it comes to Israel-Palestine?
That's an interesting question. Again, what people sometimes forget is I'm actually in the middle of a lot of debates.
Yes, of course.
I got in the elevator here, and the guy stopped me and said, "We're just talking about your piece on net zero, energy." A guy who's in a environmental consulting firm upstairs. I'm in the globalization debate. Boy, you want to see rage and anger walk into the middle of that discussion. I'm in the environmental, debate. I'm in the American foreign policy debate, and have written books about and have strong feelings about all of these things. By the way, I embrace you are entitled to say whatever you want. You know what I mean? And I totally get that, just as I am. And if you can't stand the heat, don't be in the kitchen. This is being a columnist, Peter, is not, as you I'm sure discovered being on our op-ed page, sometimes this is not a friend growth industry. If you're going to do this right, okay. I'm not running for office. I'm not looking to be popular. And at this stage in my life, I can take it. But I understand you have to take it. You should have to take it. But so much of it gets beyond just sort of the kind of serious intellectual discussion you and I might have, and really gets into the sort of takedown thing. And I'm just not interested in it, and not interested in being drained by it. And so I stay maniacally focused on what I'm doing. I recognize people disagree with me. They're entitled to them. And again, I read the comments on my column. I reflect on things that are said to and about me and in my writing. But I'm not going to allow myself to be knocked off my game or pulled one way or another.
I want to encourage people to put questions in the chat, which I'll convey some of them. I'm curious. What are the I'm interested in if there are particular, you've interacted with so many Israeli Jews and Palestinians over the course. I'm interested if who are the people that you have met on both sides of the national divide who have had the biggest impact on you, who most deeply, who made the deepest impression?
Interesting question. I'm reluctant to answer only because I don't want to leave anybody out. You know what I mean? But I'm one of the most, I wrote about it in Beirut to Jerusalem, one of the most searing experiences I had that just left an impression on me was being in George Habish's bunker in 1982 in Beirut and interviewing him and his sort of young followers.
Maybe you should tell folks who he was. Just
God, I forget. I'm so old. I forget that. George Habash was the leader of the PFLP, one of the Palestinian offshoots from the PLO, and they were responsible of hijacking the planes, the 3 planes in Jordan. That was one of the big, incidents in the. He was a dentist to the left of Arafat, but a really authentic character. And I wrote about it in Beirut to Jerusalem because I felt I was with someone who was finally having the fight he felt his parents hadn't fought, the older generation. He was finally able to do what he wanted to do, to have it out with the Israelis, and watching the dynamics between him and his young acolytes was really left a lasting impression on me, which is why I wrote about it in the book. Jamil Hilal, who was actually the spokesman of the PDFLP, another offshoot. I wrote about him in Beirut to Jerusalem too, because I used to go see him at night sometimes in Beirut in '82, and there was no electricity; there was just gaslight, and he had a transistor radio or a tape deck, and he always played Pachelbel's canon. I just have enormous memories of talking to him about Palestinians, Palestinian life, the war, to the accompaniment of Pachelbel's canon. Most of the interesting people I met, Peter, along the way, Israelis or Palestinians, were just average people and things that they said to me, that built up impressions of both sides. So it's hard for me, anyone who knows the people I quote over the years, whether it's David Hartman, or Moshe Harbatal in Israel, or Khalil Shikaki, in the Palestinian, in the West Bank. I mean, just to take a couple off the top of my head. But, the best insights come from just talking to real people, average people, about their lives and their fears, their hopes, their dreams, their angers. And but there was no one particular teacher on either side. I admired King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia a lot in his own stolid way, and my encounter with him, which produced the Our Peace Initiative, I always had a soft spot for him. So out of those are a few.
Do you think, I mean, as someone who has, many of the people you mentioned are Palestinians, and as you know, it's still not that common for American Jews to interact with Palestinians in the way that you have for your whole career. Are there certain things that struck you during those encounters about the Palestinian experience and about misconceptions about Palestinians that have stayed with you, that you feel like you wish more people understood?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm getting at. Remember, I covered Sabra and Shatila. I mean, I was actually telling a colleague that the other day, and I realized she didn't know what I was talking about. I'm so old that these things that really shaped me, the current generation doesn't even know about. What I really, the people I was attracted to most during my journalism career, and to this day, I'm going to use a word. It's the best word I can convey to express what I'm saying. It's they have an authenticity that I really admire. That it isn't performative. I think I wrote about this in Beirut to Jerusalem, but I remember when the ceasefire came in August of 1982, and these Palestinian soldiers who had been holding the line in Beirut, and they'd been like in different, snipe. I'm so sorry. Oh.
No, it's okay.
They'd been in different snipers' nests or defensive position, and to watch them come out after 30 days, and realizing what they had been up to. I appreciated, this is going to get me in a lot of trouble. This will be quoted out of context, but one of the things I've always appreciated about Hezbollah is just the hardcore seriousness of it. They blow you up, and then they don't do a big press conference. They don't issue pamphlets. There's just a hardcore seriousness about them. It's what I admired about Yitzhak Shamir. Some people earn their conservatism when Poles have turned your parents into the Nazis, and you got extradited to Uganda or Sudan by the British. You might be entitled to be a little hard-edged yourself. So it's those people on both sides who aren't part of the sort of the hoopla around this thing. They're just the hard men and women on the ground who build stuff and get stuff done one way or another. Those are the ones that I find I'm most attracted to. As a journalist, they're the ones I want to interview.
As you know, there's been a big debate in the US in the last few years about this question of whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And I'm curious, I mean, I'm just putting my cards on the table. I've always found it kind of odd, given that I don't really see how one could expect Palestinians kind of not to be anti-Zionist. I mean, at least ideologically, Zionism hasn't been great for them. But I'm curious about how, given your experience, you see that question about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
I mean, I've just never gone there. I don't think they're the same thing at all. They can be the same thing, but they are not by definition the same thing at all. You being anti-Zionist is a perfectly legitimate political position to have without being anti-Semitic. That doesn't mean there isn't some overlap by some people in some contexts. But I've just never written that, never gone there. I don't believe that for a second.
So another question that, again, I know is the kind of question that could, get you on Twitter that in ways you probably wouldn't want to be, but I have to ask it anyway, just because it's been such a live debate, and I'm curious about your position. Is a lot of people, the major human rights organizations globally, and also the Israeli and Palestinian human rights have said that Israel is practicing apartheid. It's a system of legal domination by one kind of ethno-religious group over another. I'm just, obviously that's provoked very negative reaction among a lot of Israeli and American Jews. I'm just curious how you think about it.
Well, I've used the word in my columns. I've quoted Ehud Barak and others using the word. I've used it in the context of if we don't find a way out of this very soon, that we're in a apartheid reality. And that is something that will be enormously corrosive for Israel. again, because my whole focus is getting people to move right now. I'm not sort of interested in the labeling people right now as much as getting them to move, but I'm not at all reluctant to, and haven't been in my column to use that word. So it's out there. It's very real. It's a real threat. Whether it's the full scale, perfectly analogous reality right now, I'm not going to get into that historical debate because, again, I'm much more interested in making a difference and a point right now. And how do I bring enough Israelis and Palestinians to that reality? That's my focus. But I'm not. I haven't been afraid to use that word in my column as a if not there, that's where we're going, folks. And you better be ready to defend that.
In terms of what it takes to get people to move, you've probably spoken in more synagogues than exist in many countries, and to enormous numbers of Jewish audiences. And one of the things that I think about all the time is what it takes to convince American Jews to reconsider certain things or to face certain realities that are painful for them to face. You've probably done that, tried to do that more than most people. I'm just curious, what have you learned from those experiences?
Well, I think the big thing I've learned, Peter, is that people actually don't listen through their ears, they listen through their stomach. And if you connect with people on a gut level, their attitude is, I trust you, don't bother me with the details. If you can't connect with people on a gut level, they will say, Peter, could you show me point 6 again? And I just like a few more times to go over point 7. So, I think one reason that I survived, this long as a columnist and with access, on both sides, is at a certain gut level, people understand that. Well, let me go back. I'm actually working on a book. It's sort of about how to write a column, but it's not called that. It's actually called after the biggest lesson I learned in my time as a reporter in the Middle East. The book's called What You Say When You Listen. So I was a little Jewish guy from Minneapolis who wanted to cover the Arab Muslim world in the 70s. That was not a natural thing. The New York Times had a rule then you couldn't be Jewish and go to Beirut or Jerusalem. I had to fight my way in UPI to get them to send me to Beirut. And to this day, I write things that can be very critical at times of Israelis, Arabs, Palestinians, American foreign policy, whoever. But what I've tried to be is a good listener. And I discovered that 2 things happen when you listen. One is what you learn when you listen. Almost all the mistakes I made, Peter, as a columnist, were because I was talking when I should have been listening. But much more important is what you say when you listen, because listening is a sign of respect. And it's amazing what people will let you say to them, ask them, even write about them, if they think you respect them. And if you do that, your boundaries are wide. If you don't, you can't tell them the sun is shining. And one thing I'd like to believe is that Israelis, Arabs, Palestinians today, they know I respect them. I want them all to succeed. I'm not there to put them down. Okay, I really am not. I'm there because I really want to see them thrive, because I have deep friendship. Remember, before I was in Beirut for 5 years in a civil war before I even went to Israel. My dream is to live in a world where my Lebanese friends can be with my Israeli friends. That's my nirvana. So I had a very unusual route to Israel. I didn't come via Detroit or Moscow or Vietnam. I came through a searing experience in Beirut where I was on the Titanic with people who to this day are some of my very closest friends because of what we went through together. And so I'm out there because I want to see everyone be able to realize their full potential. I really want them all to succeed. And I think enough of them on all sides know that, which is why even when I say things they disagree with, they're ready to listen or take seriously. And that's kind of all I'm about. I get it. When you're a columnist, look, 3 out of 5 people, I think, agree with what I write. 1 out of 4 are indifferent, and 1 out of 4 really oppose it. But if you're batting 600, you're in the Baseball Hall of Fame. That's all I can ask for. I don't expect everyone to agree with me, but I hope that they'll believe I'm on the level, that what I'm trying to do is find a way to maximize everyone's ability to realize their full potential. That may seem naive, but what I say to anyone who says it is, I say, no, what's naive is thinking that this is all going to be okay if we don't find a better way out. That is what brings you to the apartheid issue. It is what brings you to some really horrific situations for all the parties. So this is how I came in. This is how I'm going to go out, holding these beliefs of I'm here to do whatever I can, and I'm an aggressive optimist still, and I'm here to do whatever I can to find a way to produce a two-state solution. And if you like that, you're my friend. If you don't, you're not my reader, your enemy. But that's what I'm about. There's no secret here. I've got no secret agenda. It's all on the table. If it hasn't been clear now since I was 15 and I'm about to turn 70, then I can't help you.
You talked just at the beginning of the answer, you were talking about the kind of limitations or barriers that existed to Jewish journalists, even at the New York Times, when you were kind of coming up. One of the things I'm sure you know that Palestinians have long talked about, going back to when Edward Said talked about not having the permission to narrate, is the ways in which Palestinians find it difficult to be full participants in the conversation. I mean, there isn't a regular Palestinian columnist at the New York Times, for instance. I'm wondering how significant you think the barriers are to Palestinians being participants in this conversation on Israel-Palestine in the US, and if you've seen any change.
Yeah, I think there's validity to that grievance. At the same time, I think there's been a lot of movement since I started. We had Anthony Shadid, an Arab American who was just outstanding reporter. Anthony was of Lebanese extraction, but I think these people bring something actually special to it, as long as they're professional. I was just in our Jerusalem bureau, and we have a Israeli Arab now reporter researcher in our Jerusalem bureau. I was actually having dinner, and I was just having a fascinating talk with her, just like, what's it like? What's it like to go to Tel Aviv University as an Arab from Nazareth? What's it like to be a reporter? But when I was in Beirut, my two collaborators from the New York Times, my driver, Mohammed Kasraoui, and Ihsan Hijazi, who was, I think, the finest journalist in Beirut of his day, he and Tawfiq Mishlawi, but Ihsan worked for us. Ihsan worked for us in the Financial Times. I was Palestinian. And so no, he didn't have his own byline all the time back then, but he was a huge input in my thinking, but I believe today, well, again, we had Yusuf Ibrahim, he was our oil reporter. I think today, Isabel Kirshner, I think, is an Israeli South African who works for us. Anyone who can prove that they're, they can meet the standards of the New York Times, not only should they, but I think would, be able to be our correspondent. So I certainly would support that. To me, it's about the journalism. This is what I had to fight, Peter. Judge me by my journalism, not my biography. I've always thought it was an advantage being Jewish because the story kind of flowed through me. I knew what it was about for both sides. Or at least I thought I could know what it was about for both sides in a way that someone from Montana maybe wouldn't. But I celebrate people like Anthony Shadid, and I think what's great today is there's all kinds of bloggers too coming from these regions, and some that anyone who develops a quality reputation is really able to get their voice out there now. So the world is opened up a lot more as well.
As you know, there is a minority of younger American Jews, a significant minority, I think, who really feel alienated from Israel, and I think would probably describe themselves as anti-Zionist. You probably even know people like that. And I'm interested, when you interact with those folks, do you feel saddened? Do you feel like they like the older generation failed them? Do you feel like they have something like how do you think about that younger generation that gets so much discussion in the American Jewish community?
You know, Pierre, because I don't speak on this issue publicly
Yeah.
at all anymore.
Was that a conscious choice to decide to not speak?
Yeah, I just find that just isn't productive, you know. And so I just haven't engaged that much with that community. So I don't have a strong answer. I feel sadness if people think that Israel is that lost, you know, whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish, you know. But that's what I'm trying to fight against. But I recognize that's out there. I have two daughters, both of whom were born when I was the New York Times correspondent in Israel, and they're not in that category, you know, of anti-Zionist. But I'm aware of their generation and what's going on.
There's a question we have from Steve Frank, and he asks, if you favor a two-state solution, how do you explain the Palestinian refusal to accept repeated offers of a two-state solution? Steve's perspective is not my perspective, and I'm glad that he's articulated that way, because it's something that people say a lot. And I'm curious, especially let's narrow it to the end of the Camp David 2000 or period, the end of the Oslo period. Do you think that narrative is fundamentally correct?
You know, there's a huge historical body of historical literature on what actually happened at Camp David. And I would add also what happened with Olmert's offer to Abu Mazen, which was less formalized, but was very real. And so I'm not in a position to judge, you know, one way or another whose historical narrative is right. That it was 92%, not 95. It was 89%. It was perspective. It wasn't real. I don't know. But I do think I would say that, to me, what should have been the proper response by Arafat, let's go back to Camp David, in whatever offer Barak made, was I think the right answer should have been no. No, but we are entitled to 100%. Sadat got 100%. We are entitled to 100% of West Bank, whatever the 242 lines or whatever the foundation was. And I want to work with you now to go all over Israel and help you persuade Israelis to get from 80, 85, 90, 95, 100. That should have been the proper response. And so I don't know what happened, but I know that should have been the proper response. No, but, because if I had been waiting my whole political career for something even remotely like this to be put on the table, it seemed to me an opportunity where you had both an Israeli government and an American government aligned, that it's something that should have been the entire focus of then Palestinian diplomacy, of how we get this to the finish line. And yes, they were, triggered and distracted by Sharon going to the Temple Mount. But I really believe in T. Boone Pickens. When you're hunting elephants, don't get distracted by rabbits. And this was a historic opportunity. It may be nowhere near what Israelis claimed it was. Americans certainly have a strong view that it was something near that. I don't know at all. All I know is there was an opportunity there to build on. And I think it was a lost opportunity.
And do you buy the idea that the reason that Israeli politics has moved to the right is because this sense that the Palestinians is because of the impact of the Second Intifada and the failure of the Camp David talks? Is that, how much does that explain, even where we are now with Ben Gvir and Smotrich?
Yeah. It certainly explains a lot of it. I don't think it explains all of it. It also just became very convenient not to have to get torn apart politically, when you could cauterize the West Bank, not have to see it, not have to look at it, manage the level of violence coming out of there. And why tear yourself apart? When I think that was the logic of, so let's just pretend we can go on forever. And by the way, what I think is where we're coming now is to a point where whatever ballast and buffers enabled that to go on, Peter, I think are disappearing. I think there's a potential here for a whole bunch of disequilibria at the same time. Now, with the Ben Gvir phenomena is derivative. There was a whole policing issue inside Israel having to do with Bedouins and Israeli Arabs. But again, that's not a one-way story either. It's incomprehensible to me that there are Arab towns in Israel that have no policing. I mean, that's just sort of a budget, a governance issue. And but that's obviously something that also affected this election, so I'm told by pollsters.
What's Benjamin Netanyahu like?
Well, we don't exchange Hanukkah cards, so
You must have spent a fair amount of time with him.
Actually, so I got to know Netanyahu, I mean, as a reporter, when he was Deputy Secretary of State and I was covering Jim Baker. And you recall Jim Baker banned him from the State Department.
Yes.
At the time. So because when I was the reporter in Israel, he was not a player, and then over the years, I probably interviewed him 2 or 3 times, but then because of my views, sort of for the last 15 years, whenever he went into politics, I believe I may have spoken to him once or twice. I mean, once as prime minister, probably taking somebody to see him. I actually requested to see him while I was there on this trip. I always do, and I'm here if you want, he didn't have time. So I don't feel I particularly know him. Everyone who does tells me he's quite changed with the trial, the prospect of going to prison for corruption. That's made him crazy. So people tell me. But my anger.
Can you say crazy in what way? Can you just elaborate?
Well, to want to get into bed with these guys in order to change the law. What I have said to people and asked people on this trip, if Benjamin Netanyahu were to retire from the, I don't want to say die, but retire from the political scene tomorrow, and we wrote his final political obit, I said the question I'd like to ask him is, what would I say? What would I say? You were prime minister for longer than any other person in Israel's history been prime minister. And what? One can make the argument his economic policies helped. I don't think they were totally decisive. Some of this would have happened anyways, but helped make Israel the economic powerhouse it is today. But my resentment of him, Peter, is that he always wants to win the debate. To me, he's always that guy back at MIT in the campus debate between the Palestinian leader or the Arab leader on campus, who always wants to make a point and not a difference. And so what he's done over these 15 years, he's worn out everybody. He's worn out the Americans. He's worn out the Europeans. He's actually worn out everybody. And now what I heard on this trip is that he fancies that he's going to make peace with Saudi Arabia. Right. And to which I say, look, if you can do it, good for you. I kind of doubt it, but whatever. But there's still 3 million Palestinians on the West Bank who need governance, who have aspirations. And to me, what he's left, he's won every debate and then left Israel with this huge human problem, which he's managed to get everyone to ignore, or so many people to ignore and isolate, but it's still there. And I think that will be his legacy, that he managed to talk everyone out of doing what was necessary to solve this problem. And I went after him in that column in particular, because if you followed the Israeli election, they used Mansour Abbas as a whipping boy.
Yes.
Of this is exactly what we don't want. An Israeli Arab, the reason you don't have policing is that this Israeli Arab is in the government and he is holding our hand back. And it was so dishonest. It was so dishonest toward I met with Mansour Abbas this trip about a remarkable person, enormously decent person. And it's that level of dishonesty that I find so despicable. And the other thing, which point I've made about Netanyahu, is that Everybody knows, talk to anyone in the Israeli army, without the Palestinian Authority cooperating with Israeli, some Palestinians would say collaborating with Israeli security services, the West Bank would be in flames every day. And Netanyahu spent the last 15 years attacking Mahmoud Abbas as supporting terrorism every chance he got, delegitimizing him in the eyes of Israelis, at the same time that he knew how much they were cooperating and helping Israel maintain order and control there. It is just fundamentally dishonest. And so that's why we don't exchange Hanukkah cards.
I want to ask you one last question. There's a way for me personally that I find myself someone who's more upset at Joe Biden and his top advisors than I do at Netanyahu. Because I honestly, I think Netanyahu's a racist. I don't think he believes Palestinians are fully human. On the other hand, I feel like the Biden people, I mean, you know them better than I do. I feel like they're basically people who do have some interest generally in human rights. And yet I feel like they're sitting back and basically have decided that their obituary is going to be, they talked a lot about human rights around the world, and they basically did nothing to stop Israel from deepening apartheid with American money. Do you think that they privately hold the views that they hold publicly? And what would you say to them about why they should, about what they're doing?
Yeah, I believe it or not, I have not even had this conversation with them about this issue. I've been really focused so much more on Ukraine, and that's not an excuse, But I did everything I could to support Obama. I did everything I could to support Jim Baker. I was the one who wrote the line to Shamir, when you're serious, here's my phone number, 202-456-1414, as Baker says in his biography. I got that from Tom Friedman. So I've been doing everything I could in order to nudge and nurture every administration in that direction. And so I just want to speak for them, can't speak for them. They're also at the end of a long, sort of frustrating legacy of American foreign policy in the region. The people I'm most angry with and have written about is AIPAC and the American Jewish organizations, who have done Bibi's bidding over the years. If the reason the administrations are where they are right now, Peter, is because people like the American Jewish Committee and AIPAC at every turn use their power and influence to still the hand of any administration wanting to have a more serious and energetic and vigorous policy. And for that, they will have to answer to history. It's why I wrote once that, Bibi Netanyahu was able to speak to the US Congress because it was bought and paid for by AIPAC.
I remember that line.
Yeah. And I also wrote that he could speak there, but Bibi Netanyahu, and this is his real legacy for me, Peter, could not speak at the University of Wisconsin. If Bibi Netanyahu wanted to speak tomorrow at the University of Wisconsin, they would have to bring out the National Guard. Shame on him. That is his real legacy. And the only thing I can say about that is, after I wrote that a year after at AIPAC, next AIPAC convention, Bibi began by saying, "Is there anybody here from Wisconsin?" So, I know he got the message.
Wow.
Which is probably why he didn't have time to see me. Anyways, that's it.
That's a fascinating note on which to end. I just wanted to tell folks that next Friday, we're going to talk to Dana Al-Kurd, who's a professor at University of Richmond, has done some really fascinating work on public opinion in the Gulf, especially about the Abraham Accords, a lot of really interesting. So in the wake of all the stuff at the World Cup, I think she'll have a lot of interesting things to say about understanding the response that Israelis and Palestinians have gotten there. Tom, thank you so much for spending the hour with us. Really, really, really appreciate it.
Pleasure. I enjoyed it, Peter. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Take care. Bye-bye.